The Near East at the end of the 11th century. The endemic disunity afflicting Islam at the end of the 11th century would exert a profound influence over the course of the Crusades. So too did the Near East's distinctive cultural, ethnic, and political makeup. In truth, this region, the battleground in the war for the Holy Land, cannot be spoken of as a Muslim world. Relatively tolerant approach to subjugation adopted during the early Arab Islamic conquests meant that even centuries later, the Levant still contained a very high proportion of indigenous Christians, from Greeks and Armenians to Syrians and Copts, as well as pockets of Jewish population. Nomadic communities of Bedouins also continued to range widely across the east. Migrant Arabic-speaking Muslims who had few fixed allegiances. This long-established pattern of settlement was overlaid by a numerically inferior Muslim ruling elite, itself made up of Arabs, some Persians, and the newly arrived Turks. The Near East, therefore, was little more than a fractured patchwork of disparate social and devotional groupings, and not a purebred Islamic stronghold. As far as the main powers within the Muslim world were concerned, the Levant was also something of a backwater, notwithstanding the political and spiritual significance attached to cities like Jerusalem and Damascus. For Sunni Seljuks and Shiite Fatimids, the real centers of governmental authority, economic wealth, and cultural identity were Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Near East was essentially the border zone between these two dominant spheres of influence, a world sometimes to be contested, but almost always to be treated as a secondary concern. Even during the reign of Malik Shah, no fully determined effort was made to subdue and integrate Syria into the Sultanate, and much of the region was left in the hands of power-hungry, semi-independent warlords. Thus, when Latin crusading armies arrived in the Near East to wage what essentially were frontier wars, they were not actually invading the heartlands of Islam. Instead, they were fighting for control of a land that, in some respects, was also a Muslim frontier, one peopled by an assortment of Christians, Jews, and Muslims who, over the centuries, had become acculturated to the experience of conquest by an external force, be it at the hands of Byzantines and Persians, or Arabs and Turks. Islamic warfare and jihad. In the late 11th century, the style and practice of Muslim warfare were in a state of flux. The traditional mainstay of any Turkish fighting force was the lightly armored mounted warrior, astride a fleet-footed pony armed with a powerful composite bow that enabled him to loose streams of arrows from horseback. He might also be equipped with a light lance, single-edged sword, axe, or dagger. Also be equipped with a light sword. These troops relied upon speed of movement and rapid maneuverability to overcome their opponents. The Turks classically employed two main tactics: encirclement, whereby an enemy was surrounded from all sides by a fast-moving, swirling mass of mounted warriors, and bombarded with ceaseless volleys of arrows. And then there was feigned retreat. Again, the first was called encirclement. The second called feigned retreat, which is the technique of turning tail in battle in the hope of prompting an opponent to give fevered chase, the indiscipline of which would break their formation and leave them vulnerable to sudden counterattack. This style of combat was still favored by the Seljuks of Asia Minor, but the Turks of Syria and Palestine had begun to adopt a wider array of Persian and Arab military practices, and adjusting to the use of more heavily armored mounted lancers and larger infantry forces, and to the needs of siege warfare. By far and away, the most common forms of warfare in the Near East were raiding, skirmishing, and petty struggles over power, land, and wealth. In theory, however, Muslim troops could be called upon to fight for a supposedly higher cause, that of holy war, or that of jihad. Islam had, from its earliest days, embraced warfare, Muhammad himself prosecuted a series of military campaigns while subjugating Mecca, and the explosive expansion of the Muslim world during the 7th and 8th centuries, respectively, was fueled by an avowed devotional obligation to spread Islamic rule. The union of faith and violence within the Muslim religion, therefore, was more rapid and natural than that which gradually developed in Latin Christianity. In an attempt to define the role of warfare within Islam, Muslim scholars turned to the Quran and the Hadith, the traditions or sayings associated with Muhammad. Excuse me. These texts provide numerous examples of the Prophet advocating struggle in the path of God. In the early Islamic period, there was discussion about what this struggle, or jihad, literally striving, actually involved, and the debate continues to this day. Some, like the Muslim mystics or Sufis, argued that the most important, or the greater jihad, was the internal struggle waged against sin and error. But by the late 8th century, Sunni Muslim jurists had begun to develop a formal theory advocating what is sometimes termed the lesser jihad, rising up in arms to wage physical warfare against the infidel. To justify this, they cited canonical evidence such as verses from the 9th surah of the Quran, including "Fight the polytheists totally as they fight you totally," and hadith such as Muhammad's declaration that a morning or an evening expedition in God's path is better than the world and what it contains, and for one of you to remain in the line of battle is better than his prayers for 60 years. Legal treaties from this early period declared that jihad was an obligation incumbent upon all able-bodied Muslims, although the duty was primarily seen as being communal rather than individual, and the responsibility for leadership ultimately rested with the caliph, making reference to the likes of the hadith, "The gates of paradise are under the shadow of the swords." These treatises also affirmed that those fighting in the jihad would be granted entry to the heavenly paradise. Jurists posited a formal division of the world into two spheres: the Dar al-Islam, or House of Peace, the area within which Muslim rule and law prevailed, and the Dar al-Harb, or House of War, the rest of the world. The express purpose of the jihad was to wage a relentless holy war in the Dar al-Harb, or House of the War, or the rest of the world, and until such time as all mankind had accepted Islam or submitted to Muslim rule. And so basically, it's the House of War. Okay, the express purpose of holy war or jihad was to wage a relentless holy war in the House of War, or the entire world, until such time as all mankind has accepted Islam or submitted to Muslim rule. No permanent peace treaties with non-Muslim enemies were permissible, and any temporary truces would last no more than 10 years. As the centuries passed, the driving impulse toward expansion encoded in this classical theory of jihad was gradually eroded. Arab tribesmen began to settle into more sedentary lifestyles and to trade with non-Muslims, such as the Byzantines. Holy wars against the likes of Christians continued, but they became far more sporadic and often were prompted and prosecuted by Muslim emirs without caliphal endorsement. By the 11th century, the rulers of Sunni Baghdad were far more interested in using jihad to promote Islamic orthodoxy by battling heretic Shiites than they were in launching holy wars against Christendom. The suggestion that Islam should engage in an unending struggle to enlarge its borders and subjugate non-Muslims held little currency. So too did the idea of unifying in defense of the Islamic faith in its territories. When the Christian Crusaders began, the ideological impulse of devotional warfare thus lay dormant within the body of Islam, but the essential framework remained in place. Islam and Christian Europe on the eve of the Crusades. A charged and vexatious question remains: did the Muslim world provoke the Crusades, or were these Latin holy wars acts of aggression? This fundamental inquiry requires an assessment of the overall degree of threat posed to the Christian West by Islam in the 11th century. In one sense, Muslims were pressing on the borders of Europe. To the east, Asia Minor had served for generations as a battleground between Islam and the Byzantine Empire, and Muslim armies had made repeated attempts to conquer Christendom's greatest metropolis, Constantinople. To the southwest, Muslims continued to rule vast tracts of the Iberian Peninsula and might one day push north against beyond the Pyrenees. In reality, however, Europe was by no means engaged in an urgent struggle for survival on the eve of the Crusades. No coherent or pan-Mediterranean onslaught threatened, because although the Moors in Iberia and the Turks in Asia Minor shared a common religious heritage, they were never united in one purpose. In fact, after the first forceful surge of Islamic expansion, the interaction between neighboring Christian and Muslim polities had been relatively unremarkable, characterized like that between any potential rivals by periods of conflict and others of coexistence. There's little or no evidence to suggest that these two world religions were somehow locked in an inevitable and perpetual clash of civilizations. From the 10th century onwards, for example, Islam and Byzantium developed a tense, sometimes quarrelsome respect for one another, but their relationship was no more fraught with conflict than that between the Greeks and their Slavic or Latin neighbors to the west. This is not to suggest that the world was filled with utopian peace and harmony. The Byzantines were only too happy to exploit any signs of Muslim weakness. Thus, in the year 969, while the Abbasid world fragmented, Greek troops pushed eastward, recapturing much of Asia Minor and recovering the strategically significant city of Antioch. And with the advent of the Seljuk Turks, Byzantium faced renewed military pressure. In 1071, Seljuks crushed an imperial army at the Battle of Manzikert in eastern Asia Minor, and though historians no longer consider this to have been an utterly cataclysmic reversal for the Greeks, it still was a stinging setback that presaged notable Turkish gains in Anatolia. 15 years later, the Seljuk Turks also recovered Antioch. Meanwhile, in Spain and Portugal, Christians had begun to reconquer territory from the Moors. In the year 1085, the Iberian Latins achieved a deeply symbolic victory, seizing control of Toledo, the ancient Christian capital of Spain. Nevertheless, at this stage, the Latins' gradual southward expansion seems to have been driven by political and economic stimuli and not religious ideology. The conflict in Iberia did become more heated after the year 1086, when a fanatical Islamic sect known as the Almoravids invaded Spain from North Africa, supplanting surviving indigenous Moorish power in the peninsula. This new regime reinvigorated Muslim resistance, scoring a number of notable military victories against the Christians of the north. But Almoravid aggression cannot really be said to have sparked the Crusades, because the Latin holy wars launched at the end of the 11th century were directed towards Levant, not Iberia. So what did ignite the war between Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land? In one sense, the Crusades were a reaction to an act of Islamic aggression, the Muslim conquest of sacred Jerusalem, but this had taken place in 638, and thus was hardly a fresh offense. At the start of the 11th century, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, thought to enclose the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, had been partially demolished by the volatile Fatimid ruler known to history as the Mad Caliph Hakim. His subsequent persecution of the local Christian population lasted for more than a decade, ending only when he declared himself a living God and turned on his own Muslim subjects. Tensions also seem to have been running high in the year 1027, when Muslims reportedly threw stones into the compound of the Holy Sepulchre. More recently, Latin Christians attempting to make devotional pilgrimages to the Levant, of whom there continued to be many, reported some difficulties in visiting the holy places and spread stories of Eastern Christian repression in Muslim Palestine. Two Arabic accounts offer important but divergent insights into these issues. Ibn al-Arabi, a Spanish Muslim pilgrim who set out for the Holy Land in 1092, described Jerusalem as a thriving center of religious devotion for Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike. He noted that Christians were permitted to keep their churches in a good state of repair, and gave no hint that pilgrims be they Greek or Latin, were suffering abuse or interference. By contrast, the mid 12th century Aleppan chronicler Al-Azimi wrote that the people of the Syrian ports prevented Frankish and Byzantine pilgrims from crossing to Jerusalem. Those of them who survived spread the news about that to their countries, so they prepared themselves for military invasion. Clearly, Al-Azimi at least believed that Muslim attacks triggered the Crusades. In fact, on the basis of all the surviving evidence, the case could be argued in either direction. By 1095, Muslims and Christians had been waging war against one another for centuries. No matter how far it was in the past, Islam undoubtedly has seized Christian territory, including Jerusalem, and Christians living in and visiting the Holy Land may have been subjected to persecution. On the other hand, the immediate context in which the Crusades were launched gave no obvious clue that a titanic transnational war of religion was either imminent or inevitable. Islam was not about to initiate a grand offensive against the West, nor were the Muslim rulers of the Near East engaging in acts akin to ethnic cleansing or subjecting religious minority groups to widespread and sustained oppression. There may at times have been little love lost between Christian and Muslim neighbors, and perhaps there were outbreaks of intolerance in the Levant. But there was, in truth, little to distinguish all of this from the endemic political, military, and social struggles of the age. And so we have two more parts to go through, and then that will conclude our part on the Crusades.